Hello, we're back for another answer time. This time we have a history question, and it's a good one, I think. Very broad, but a very good question. The question is, what are the more pivotal moments in the history of England, specifically the royalty? So, British royal history, okay? I've heard names like Anne Boleyn and Queen Elizabeth, but I have no concept of anything pivotal that occurred in England other than when the American colonies revolted. All right. So, obviously, a very broad question, but we're going to take it from the top and we're going to give you a high level overview that will give you a sense of all the things that happen, um, but not go in too much detail, I hope, about any specific thing. And how I'm going to do that is by utilizing a Wikipedia list of English monarchs, and we're just going to go down the we're just going to go down the list. So before we start, first we should know when England started, because obviously the islands have been there for a very long time, including before English. All right, so we had the Romans had England as part of their empire. As the Roman Empire collapsed, you started getting Germanic invaders. The invaders into the British Isles were primarily Angles, Angels, and Saxons, which is you put those together, and that's where you get Anglo-Saxon. England literally comes from England, meaning land of the Angles. So that's what England is. There's no England before the Germanic invasions. Now, there's no the Germanic invasions caused a bunch of small Germanic kingdoms to be all over the country. And then later, Vikings started invading, and that makes it even more confusing because then you had Viking kingdoms and things like that going on. But there was no unified kingdom until Alfred the Great. So he was the one who unified it. He came from the kingdom of Wessex. Wessex is still a region in England. But he came... Well, we're going to zoom this in. There we go. So he came from the region of Wessex, which is what I'm circling my mouse around over here. And then he united England. So he is, if we scroll down here, our first English king. Can I make it a hair bigger? Oops. There we go. He is our first English king, Alfred the Great. Also, the only king in England, or royalty in England, to ever get the epithet the Great. That's how special he is. And we're all the way back here in the 9th century, the 800s. And so he founded the House of Wessex. And then he had a son, and there was battling, and, the Anglo-Saxons were very big on internal struggles amongst their nobility. And then the House of Wessex comes back in, and these have great names. These guys have great names like Edward the Elder and Ethelwerd and Ethelsla. I can't even say it. Edmund. Edred. Okay. But these guys, you mostly don't... everyone's story is individually interesting. However, if we're just getting an overview of England, you don't really need to care about them too much. Until we get to this guy. This guy caused problems. Notice that he's the end of this list of the House of Wessex. Ethelred the Unready. Oh, wait. Yes, so Ethelred the Unready, he had to fight for his throne with the House of Denmark. The House of Denmark, surprisingly, not comes from Denmark. And there was this king there, Sven Forkbeard. Sven, something along those lines. Forkbeard. Forkbeard being, you take your mustache and your beard and you tie it together in a very Viking way. All right, so Sven Forkbeard, son of Harold Bluetooth, the guy they named Bluetooth on your phone after, invades England, and he tries to take over, and Ethelred at this point goes over to Normandy. Remember Normandy? Normandy's going to be important. Sven dies. Ethelred, the Unready, comes back and gets to be king again. Okay. But then, Canute the Great, he comes back. So now we got the Denmark back in there again. Okay? Now, we don't have to remember too much about these guys at the moment, but this is leading up to a very important moment, so that's where I'm giving you them one at a time. So remember, we had Ethelred, and Ethelred gets knocked out by the Danes. He comes back. His son gets into... his son takes over. Sven's son comes back, takes over, right? And then we have that going on a little bit. And then after his two sons rule. His second son, Harthacnut, gets, let's see, he dies, yeah, at the age of about 24, so probably violently. We get the House of Wessex again. House of Wessex and the Danes, just fighting back and forth. Them and the Vikings, back and forth. Then we get Edwin the Confessor. All right, so we had Ethelred the Unready. So of the House of Wessex, the three names to remember: Alfred the Great made England. Ethelred the Unready was unready to fight off the Danes. And then finally, the last one, Edward the Confessor. Now, he's called the Confessor because he was a very pious man. He cared about his religion, confessed a lot. Ethelred, in church, because there was no schism at this point. Everything was Catholic. Edward the Confessor. Okay. Or no Protestantism. That comes later in this story. Now, Edward the Confessor. It says right here, the important thing. No children. Okay, so he didn't have an heir. So then the question goes to, well, what family, crazy tree business do you follow through to find out who's going to get the king? Shit. Well, there were 3 good claims of various strength. One was this guy, Harold Godwinson. And he was supposedly named the heir of Edward the Confessor. Supposedly. Now, whoops, trying not to highlight things so we don't have things popping up on the screen. Now, there was another guy. This guy, William the Conqueror. He is known as the Conqueror because he won. Oh, my screen blanked. Okay, there we go. I think I have a cord just a little loose. He won. So William also had a claim to the throne because he was like third cousin, twice removed on the aunt side of, Edward the Confessor's great uncle's, mistress's neighbor. One of those really long, convoluted things. He, prior to Edward dying, once invited Harold Godwin to come over, to Normandy, where William was Duke. At the time, he was known as William the Bastard because he was a bastard. His father had him out of wedlock. He invited Harold to come over. They feasted. He made Harold promise him in a dinner with witnesses that he would let William take the throne. And Harold's like, yeah, sure. That's when William revealed that he had had that whole dinner staged above the remains of a saint, the relics of a saint, which then made it a religious promise. And Harold then tried to argue that it was a promise not made knowingly on the bones of a saint, so it doesn't actually count as that, and back and forth. And, well, Harold tried, to take it. And Harold did. He got control of England in January, as you can see here, and he ruled for almost a year. The Norwegians invaded, and Harold cast them off, and that was the last time Norwegians really come into our story, or the Norse folk come into our story. But William shows up, Battle of Hastings, and in the Battle of Hastings, single battle, crushes Harold's power, the Anglo-Saxon power, and kills Harold. And so he becomes king. And then he has to spend a lot of time just, wrapping up the rest of the country, wrapping up his control. But he becomes king of England. And now we start having kids, and here we get interesting. This was the second son of William to rule. William the Conqueror to rule. Henry the First. So we get to Henry the First. Now we have an interesting kerfuffle that probably doesn't it's pretty important. So he had 2 children, a son and a daughter. His son dies in a shipwreck of the White Ship. So he names his daughter as his heir, right? Now, before he did that, he had named his nephew, Stephen of Blois, as his heir. So, now we have what is known as the Anarchy. Because it was a big old mess. Warfare between the supporters of the House of Blois, with Stephen here, and Matilda. Now, she was never actually crowned, but she was attempting to be crowned. Her first marriage, she's listed as Empress here, because her first marriage was to the Holy Roman Emperor, but he died, and then she married Geoffrey of Anjou, so couldn't really call on the same level of power and support. But she really was the first woman to hold the crown, or to hold power over England. But she wasn't actually crowned, so, King Stephen and Matilda came to an agreement. So the agreement was that Stephen recognized Henry, the son of Matilda, as his heir, right? So that's how they sorted out. I get to be king. Your son will come after me. Come after me as king, not come after me to kill me. Just got to be clear. We are talking about royalty here. So that is now the House of Anjou, or the Plantagenets. I can never pronounce this word. Plantagenets. It's French. Who cares? We're just going to call them the Plants, because it will become relevant. All right, so now Henry II becomes king. And yay, we have one solid path here. Okay. Henry II had some very interesting children. The first of which was Richard the Lionheart. We should point out here 2 things. Eleanor of Aquitaine was his wife. Eleanor is one of the most interesting women in medieval European history as a power player. She had so much power over so many things and was able to orchestrate so many things over the course of her life. Very interesting woman. You should go learn more about Eleanor. But anyway, Henry, probably not that great of a dad, because, his sons fought against him. They got, lands to rule while he was alive, and they rebelled against him. Sons fought against each other. It wasn't great. But the first son to actually take the throne was Richard I. Richard the Lionheart very famous as a warrior. He was very good at it. During the Third Crusade, he was the one who brought the end of the myth of invincibility of Saladin, and he conquered Cyprus on his way there, and very, very powerful as a warrior. Not so good with the rest of it. He kind of left England broke with his war fighting. He did things like he conquered Cyprus, which was a very rich province, could have helped with his money issues, but he just gave it away to another guy who lost his kingdom in the Middle East, and he's like, yeah, you're king of Cyprus now. Didn't really get anything out of that, so he wasn't a thinker. He also just kept fighting. He actually died in battle in a siege. There was he was observing the siege works, and a crossbowman just shot him. Didn't know he was shooting at the king, but didn't matter. Crossbow bolt didn't care. Shot him and killed him. Age 41. This comes then to King John. Now, Richard and John are should be somewhat familiar as pivotal characters in Robin Hood stories. Now, John, yes, he was a conniving dude who wasn't a great guy. Really wasn't worse than Richard as not great guys, though. But the problem is that Richard gets held up as heroic in myth, and John just as a pure villain. John did not have Richard's flair for warfare. John was as good as Richard was at war. John was as good at in politics. Just being able to balance sides. There were multiple times where it looked like John was on really shaky ground, but he put down rebellions. He was almost invaded by the Holy Roman Empire, and he had problems with France and with and with the Pope, the Catholic Church, which the Catholic Church at that time could excommunicate you, and they could declare you basically open season on you for other major European powers to attack. But John very deftly managed to somehow worm his way out of problems that weren't all his own making. Some of those problems came from Richard. Some of them came from John. Okay, so yeah, there was a bit where John was fighting the First Barons' War that Louis the Eighth of France kind of got control of a lot of England. But anyway, we're back to our plant house here. We get Henry III. Henry III, if I remember right here, yes, son of John. So we're out of Henry II's sons, and we're back kind of steady. Edward Longshanks, where you might have heard that this guy's name was from the movie Braveheart. Longshanks was another big conquering kind of guy. Fought a lot up in Scotland. I believe he fought he fought a lot of wars. You know now to connect Edward I, Edward Longshanks, with you know now to connect Edward Longshanks with Braveheart. You have him in place now. All right, we have a bunch more Edwards. Richard II comes in here. Okay. So, now this is where the plants come involved. So I talked about the planets, because we're all the planted nets. All right. So at this point, Richard II has no children, no one to think. So it's going to go off to a cousin. These cousins, they had land, they had stuff, power bases. They became like, you have your royal house extra children often come up and make their own houses that are subservient to your house, but they're their own royal lines. So we have the House of Lancaster. Now, House of Lancaster rules for a bit. We have the House of York. The House of York also rules. And the House of Lancaster. You know what this is called? So the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Let's see if we can see it. Oh, no, we're not going to see it right here, are we? My bad. Okay. The House of Lancaster and the House of York had these flowers as their symbols. Start fighting for it back and forth, and you get the War of the Roses, because those were their symbols. The white roses and the red roses. War of the Roses, 30 years of war, Wars of the Roses, I'm sorry. 30 years of war, brutal war, super interesting because we're very late in the Middle Ages here, so you have a lot of like heavy armor combat, and really interesting for that kind of thing. But as you see, it goes back and forth. Now we get to Richard III. Richard III is an interesting character. He is generally considered one of England's greatest bad guys, basically. Okay. So, we have this guy, Edward IV. All right. He was the brother, Richard III. And he had 10 children, 2 boys who were in line for becoming king. Now, we go from there to his son. So he died about the age of 40. His son is very young in this portrait. It's because his son disappeared in the Tower of London under the care of his uncle, Richard III. This young boy and his brother both were in the care of Richard III in the Tower of London, which was both prison, fort, and palace. So it was all those things at once. And he and his brother disappeared. And it's one of the great, archaeological mysteries in London. If you could find the bones and determine if they were murdered or not. Because they could have died. People just died a lot back then, too. You know, he got a particularly bad flu or who knows. You know, that could have happened. Outbreak of the plague. Those things, kinds of things happened. But Richard was kind of known as a shady-ish character. He really could have murdered them. Anyway, he goes off and he rules for about 2 years, and he dies in battle at Bosworth Field. Now, so we have a new family that, remember, we had the plague. Let's take it back. We had the house from William the First. That goes down, and you have that House of Blois moment with Matilda and Stephen. Matilda's son, who she was a thing from the House of William's house. Her son becomes king. We have another moment of crisis, and we have a nephew that becomes king with another house. This line, that line comes from John of Gaunt. The House of Lancaster did. The House of York, those come from thing. The House of Tudor comes from an illegitimate child of John of Gaunt. So we still have this tenuous blood connection running down. And we start here with Henry VII. Henry VII won by right of conquest. He won the Battle of Bosworth Field, and he had that blood connection, though tenuous. And he married Elizabeth of York, giving him a blood power tie. All right. Henry VII is interesting in that military aspect. I believe Henry VII was the one who started really putting England on a path of seeking naval power. But his boy, one of the most famous kings of England, Henry VIII. Henry VIII is a fascinating character. As you'll see, number one, we have all the wives. Catherine of Aragon, and it just goes on. First, got to step it back. Henry VIII starts his life as quite a competent ruler, very competent. Competent in domestic politics, military, and in religious studies. He actually, so this is after Martin Luther has started the Reformation. Henry VIII personally wrote very impassioned essays about Catholicism, defending Catholicism, very impassioned, very intellectual. So much so that the Pope actually named Henry VIII a defender of the Catholic faith. But Henry VIII had one problem, and that was having sons. He just couldn't manage to do it. So we start off with Catherine of Aragon. She was his brother's wife, who died. The brother died before Henry took the throne. Normally that would be a big no-no to marry your brother's widow, but he had it ruled that they never did the deed, even though they should have, so it was an abrogation of his older brother's marriage duties, which made the marriage a sham, which meant that he could marry Catherine. It wasn't that you couldn't marry a widow, because widows definitely got married. It was the whole brother thing, which, I mean, yeah, that'd be weird. She had a daughter. He couldn't manage to, she was older, and he respected her a lot. There's actually a very interesting relationship that he had with her. But then he also, after getting the Catholic Church to say, you know what, they weren't married, he got the Catholic Church to annul their marriage. But then we Anne Boleyn. Very famous, the Boleyn sisters. But she had a daughter, Jane Seymour, had a son. He managed one son. The son died in a shipwreck, I believe. Let's check that real quick. I believe her son died in a shipwreck. Issue. No, he was... How did you die? No, he just died sickly. He died sickly. That's right. Shipwrecks are so important in England that sometimes you just think everyone dies in a shipwreck. But no, he was just sick and died very young. Right here. Okay, so he was born... So he was like 10 years old when he became king. If I'm reading my math right here. Let's make sure that's birth. Yeah, so he was like 10 years old. 9 years old, actually, because earlier in the year. And he died at the age of like 15. And of course, he wasn't married because he was 15 years old and he didn't have any kids. So, Henry VIII gives us another mess. It should also be mentioned that some people think that, I've seen theories that Henry VIII was suffered a head trauma and that he got weird and thing after that. He later became very fat. He's very famous for that. But anyway, so Edward the Sixth, named Lady Jane Grey, who was who I guess was his aunt, great granddaughter of or cousin. Anyway, ties back up to Henry VII, not the Eighth, as his heir. She gets executed. She ruled for about 9 days. Instead, we get Mary. This Mary, as you can see here, known as Bloody Mary. So, I forgot to mention, he was a defender of the faith of Catholicism. With Anne Boleyn, Pope wouldn't give him a second divorce, even though she only had a daughter. Can you believe it? The Pope didn't see that as a reason for divorce. Henry VIII said, you know what? Screw you. I'm going to be in my own religion now. It's the thing we're doing now. And that's when the Church of England got set up. This is why the Church of England, though technically Protestant, retains a lot of Catholic structure. Henry VIII liked Catholicism. He just wanted to be able to sign his own divorce papers. And that's why the monarch of England is the head of the Church of England. It's because Henry VIII wanted to be able to sign his own divorce papers. So, here's the thing. Mary, who was daughter of Henry VIII, with his wife, Catherine of Aragon, back when Henry was very, very Catholic, she was very Catholic because after they'd split up, Mary went off with Catherine, I believe, and Spain is very Catholic, and grew up with a lot of Catholics. She married Philip II of Spain, another Catholic. She is known as Bloody Mary because she believed in bloodily assaulting all the Protestants that refused to switch back now to Catholicism. There were a lot of Protestants who were like, no, I'd like being a Protestant. Not just of the Church of England, but of the other sects. And Mary bloodily persecuted them. We'll follow there with Philip, kind of, because he was married to Mary. He was technically the king. But Mary was the one really doing stuff. Okay. Then Mary dies, and Elizabeth becomes queen. She, again, another daughter of Henry VIII. She is one of the most powerful monarchs in all of British history. Really a knockoff the old block of Henry VIII before he went crazy. She is the one who gets England started in colonizing the Americas. She becomes a thorn in the side of Spain. So if you ever hear of the Spanish Armada, which was when Spain attempted an English invasion, she was the one, her and Weather, were the ones who stopped that. And another interesting thing, she realized, like with Mary, she got married, there'd be a king now, the king would get power, she would lose power. She refused to marry. She lived to the age of 69, and she was known as the Virgin Queen because she never got married. Was she a virgin? Probably not. Her court was a very vibrant place. Her court, by the way, was the first court that Shakespeare was playing in. This is the time of Shakespeare. So we have American colonies, we have Shakespeare, we have the Spanish Armada, and the Virgin Queen, all together. Of course, she died because she wasn't immortal, and she hadn't married, so she had no heirs. So it goes to another cousin. So, yes, first cousin twice removed, James the First. Now, James was very chill with, he was a Protestant still, because they had the Presbyterians up in England, or up in Scotland. So it was very easy for him to become king, and he did a pretty good job of keeping the peace. Technically, this is fun. So the thrones, he was already king of Scotland when he inherited the throne of England. He was not James the First of Scotland. He was James the Sixth. So he was James the Sixth and First, because he got that throne first, and then he became James the First of England. and the thrones were not united, in theory, he could have two different heirs and split them back up. That didn't happen, but in theory it could have. Excuse me. James, besides being a good king, is famous for commissioning a translation of the Bible that is the King James Version. That's that James. That version of the Bible is not magical, as some people like to point out, like to believe, but it is a very good translation. He had a lot of very top-end scholars of Greek and Hebrew work on it. He's paid a lot of money for it. That's that. Now, his son Charles, very spicy. The only English king to lose his head, not in a battle here. And he's going to clash with Parliament a lot. Parliament technically had been a thing all the way back, like with King John, all the way back then. But now it's a real political force at this point. And he clashes with them a lot. And that's when we're going to get the English Civil Wars. The English Civil Wars end with Charles getting captured and his head chopped off. And at that point, we're technically a republic. It didn't last very long because fighting for the republic and winning the war, because he was a very good soldier, was this guy, Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell then immediately staged a coup and named himself dictator. Not king, dictator. Protector was his title, but he was dictator of England. He tried passing it off to his son after death. Didn't work out so well. His son was incompetent. They already didn't like the dictatorship. Son was incompetent. That was the end of that. They actually invite back Charles II. So that was Charles's son, the guy who got his head cut off. They invite back his son, who had been living in France. Charles restores the Stuart throne, and he's pretty live and let live about the whole thing. He adopts Protestantism because he has to be the head of the Church of England. He's like, yeah, I'll be head of the Church of England and Protestant if I get to be king. And so that all works out. Except then we have his son, James. James is the last king of England to get overthrown, because James comes to the throne after the death of his brother, because he's the son of Charles I. Note. Now, so these two are brothers, Charles and James. He wasn't so cool with going back to being Protestant. He liked this whole French Catholicism thing. And England's like, we're still not okay with that. We still remember Mary. And at this point, people are way more rooted into their Protestantism. So, he gets overthrown in what's known as the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution, they invite Mary, who is the daughter of James II. So, daughter of James II. So his daughter, they invite her. She was married to a Dutch guy. The Dutch were a superpower at this point in time. William. He was William of Orange, because the oranges were... Anyway, we're not talking about Dutch politics. We're talking about British royalty. So she was married to William, and William and Mary came with William's army, and James II said, you know what, I'll just abdicate. And so they said, okay, great. Mary II, William became William III, ruled jointly, and William and Mary, the college in Virginia, was founded in their honor during their rule, actually, I believe. And so William and Mary also a period of furniture, lots of great things. One of the things that happened is it became law that you have to be Anglican to become king or queen of England. That's just it. You have to do it. And so then that way we don't have any more of this Catholic coming to the throne, it being an issue business. No more of that. You have to be Anglican, which has worked out since then for the last 300-ish years. All right, so William and Mary, they rule together. It's a great old time. James II, William and Mary, this is the time of Isaac Newton being a potent force in politics in England. Bet you didn't know he was a politician too. Newton did everything. All right, they have a daughter, Anne. Anne rules for 5 years as Queen of England before we have the Act of Union and there's no more King or Queen of England. What do I mean by that? So they had been, all of these folks since James the Sixth and First had been both King of England or Queen and Scotland separately. The Act of Unification said, you know what? Let's permanently bind these two countries together so that they have one government instead of two. And that's when we get Great Britain. So, we have to go to a different page now. Great Britain starts with Queen Anne. And she rules for another 7 years. Now, she dies. And she had 5 children. But let's see. But it goes to another cousin, who in theory still has that trace of blood from William the Conqueror. That real faint trace of blood somewhere in there. But another cousin, and this is where we get George the First. George was the Elector Duke, I believe, of Hanover in Germany. He was German because they had to find a Protestant relative, remember. Had to be Protestant and would become Anglican upon ascending to the throne. George didn't speak English at all. He spoke German. He never learned English. There were some rebellions up in Scotland. They wanted a Stuart back on the throne, Catholic or not. But George in the House of Hanover. This is the House of Hanover. Yes, the House of Hanover. George the First. Okay. George the Second kind of spoke English. Interesting thing about George the First. George the First in Hanover, had a court mathematics guy working his, for his science creds, right? A math guy named Leibniz. Then he went over to England, where Leibniz was persona non grata, and he became a Newton fan. But he let Leibniz keep working in Hanover. And that's a whole, scientific community spat here, tied right into our royalty. George II, also, I believe, born in, still born in Germany. So he was still very much a German. Fairly stable rule, not that great of a ruler. Then we get George III. Ironically, George III, very competent ruler, who went nuts in the end of his days. There's still a lot of debate about if it was a hereditary blood disease or what have you. But yeah, he was a... George III also, of course, famous for he was the king during the American Revolution. Wasn't a great politician. Interesting things about George. He really liked farming. That's what he wanted to do. He spent a lot of time out on the estates of the royal family, actually engaged in farming. He was also a book lover. He had a plain wife. Let's see if we can... Yeah. Can we see a picture of her? She was regarded as being very plain. But unlike his parents, grandparents, the Georges before him, and the rest of the House of Hanover coming after him, or his sons after him, he was not a womanizer. He really loved his plain wife. And they had 15 children. He really loved his plain wife. But that's, yeah, they just went through that. And George is an interesting character in history. He's neither totally villain nor hero, villain nor saint. He's an interesting guy. Okay, so notice, he died and his rule ended in 1820. He went crazy way before that. So the Napoleonic Wars were done in 1815 with Waterloo. They needed a competent king who wasn't just crazy and afraid of light and disheveled, and, So, but there was no law on the books that would let them have a regent helping out. So like his son couldn't take part of the thing. That he could give it to his son, but he wasn't mentally competent enough to do that. So that was called the Regency crisis, and they were able to work that out. And that was then what was called the Regency period. You'll hear a lot about Regency period dramas or Regency furniture or anything like that. That's the Regency. The man who would become George IV's Regency for George III. Now, George IV ruled for about 10 years, and he was an incompetent drunk womanizer, basically. Then it goes to another child of George III, because remember, he had 15, William. William, from what I remember, isn't much better. But we have a granddaughter of George, Queen Victoria. She comes into power in 1837 and rules to 1901. So that's the Victorian period. But whenever you think Victorians, you're probably thinking about like the 1880s, 1890s. This is a very broad period. So we went from womanizers to the biggest prude of England's, royal families, right? So, despite the fact that she knew what was going on. She had 9 kids herself. But, and her consort never became king. She retained power. So we figured that out by this point. Actually, so I think that started with Mary, the second of William and Mary. Or was that the third? Anyway, Mary of William and Mary. So Victoria, in the very early stages of her rule, England was just as bawdy with the bawdy humor and the impropriety and all of that as it was with the Georges in the William IV. Yeah. And it was much later that the social mores had moved on. And I blame the Victorians, not her specifically, but people, English of that era, for a lot of things. And a lot of people who like history blame them for a lot of things. Yes, the Victorians did bad things with imperialism and stuff like that. Our complaint is they made up a bunch of crap about the previous generations and centuries that people still believe. Even people who are like, the Victorians are terrible, still believe Victorian lies because they told a lot of them. So never believe, on the face of it, something the Victorians told us. And you need to figure out what stuff came from the Victorians and what stuff didn't. Things as basic as women's traditional role in society. The Victorians are the ones who made up that women stayed in the home. Total bull. For most of history, most women have been working, engaged in the process of providing for the family. Whether that's working on the farm, working jobs, spindles, working weavers, jobs. They're working real jobs. They would do homemaking too, but like as part of the suite of taking care of the family. Only the rich didn't go out because only the rich could afford that. Lies of the Victorian era. So many. All right. Okay. Oh, important thing. We've switched house names. So this was the House of Hanover up to Victoria. Victoria, kids, still obviously have the blood of the House of Hanover because they were her kids. But they take the house name of her husband, who was a German dude, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Right, so you have Edward the Fourth with his nice beard being of that house. But George the Fifth, he had a problem because World War II happened. So, in 1917, they changed the name because Saxe-Coburg and Gotha is very German. So they chose the most English name they could come up with, Windsor. And that's the House of Windsor. They're Germans. Now, so George wasn't expected to become king. So he had, as he was dying in the end, his physician basically gave him a speedball. What's a speedball? Opium and cocaine together. The idea behind a speedball, if you're a drug user, is that the effects of the cocaine and the opium, whether that's morphine or however you're taking it, counterbalance each other. So you don't get the jitteriness of the cocaine, but you get the high, and you don't get the lethargy of the opium, but you get the mellow. But cocaine wears off a lot faster, so then you'll have this huge opium dose that you were counteracting with cocaine, and the cocaine wears off and you just go into a opium overdose. You just drift off into an opium overdose and die. I believe that's what killed... a speedball is what killed John Belushi. Couldn't think of his last name. I'm ashamed. I kept wanting to say Ritter, and that's not correct. But speedball is what killed John Belushi. George V's he was on his deathbed. He was dying slowly. His physician gave him a speedball, which to euthanize him. And on the one hand, okay, doctor, you can have feelings on that. But part of his reasoning was he wanted to make sure the death happened at a time that they could get it out for the morning papers. They could print it out. That's a little weird. Okay, so George, then, so he died in 1936. We have Edward the Eighth. Edward the Eighth abdicated less than a year. Why did he abdicate? He wanted to marry an American divorcee. There's questions about whether he had Nazi sympathizing tendencies, but he left to get married. That's the official reason. Then from him goes to his brother, George the Sixth. George the Sixth rules through 1952. It means he ruled through World War II, worked with Churchill, all of that. No, George, he's the one who probably had the King's Speech. I misspoke. Let's see. Yes. George, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to you, George the Fifth. You're Speedball Man. You're not Stammer Man. So George the Sixth is Stammer Man. And, yep, by this point, royal power is very minimal. And then, of course, we get Queen Elizabeth, the first person in this montage to have a color photograph. She's still kicking. She's had a very interesting life. She saw basically the last vestiges of royal power go off into the elected government. And, yeah. all kinds of other interesting issues there that she's had to deal with. She's seen a lot of stuff. But that is your rundown of the kings and queens of England and the most interesting parts. Technically, so we shifted over to Great Britain, right? Technically, now they're the United Kingdom. That happened in the 1800s, early on. But that's the full scope. This was much easier to do than your Elder Scrolls question, which I'm going to get to. I have a much clearer idea of how I'm going to answer that. But I hope this has been helpful. Please send me more questions about whatever comes to mind, and I'll try to answer them the best I can. If this caused more questions, just shoot them on over to me, and I'll try to answer them. This has been your brief history of British royalty. Oops. I'll talk to you guys later. Send me more questions. Catch you next time. Bye.